Thank you, everyone, for being here, and welcome to Inside the Margin. My name is Bryce Cracknell. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of The Margin. As many of you all know, our mission is to produce investigative, data-driven, and deeply human journalism that centers voices of frontline communities. Inside the Margin is our way of opening up that reporting process, bringing you directly into the conversation with journalists, photographers, and community members at the heart of our stories. Today, we're focusing on our feature, Pursuing Higher Ground, which examines the human and environmental toll of Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina, 6 months after the storm arrived. Today is September 8th, and it's been almost 1 year since that storm came through, and it's still one of the most devastating storms in U.S. history. I'm pleased to be joined by three incredible guests who helped bring this story to life and will help contextualize today's conversation. First, we have Christian Monterrosa, who is an independent photojournalist based in Brooklyn. He specializes in national politics, natural disasters, and migration. His documentary approach focuses on long-form visual storytelling, drawing from personal experience to highlight underrepresented communities. His work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, and of course, The Margin, among others. Christian's photography is rooted in empathy, access, and a commitment to truth. We also have Trey Walk, who is a writer from South Carolina, currently living in Brooklyn. He has worked with organizations across the US on community organizing, providing direct client services, and winning policy change. He's worked at the Groundwork Project, Equal Justice Initiative, and Human Rights Watch. Trey provides freelance research on consulting services for several nonprofits and digital publications, and his portfolio shines a light on forgotten histories and communities. And last but not least, we have Gaelen Corozine. He's a farmer, educator, and father in Burnsville, North Carolina. His family and community were heavily impacted by Hurricane Helene. He's a co-owner of the Green Toe Ground Farm and a board member of Arthur Morgan School, where he taught for 4 years. Together, we'll talk about how this story came together, what it reveals about the new realities of climate change, and how Appalachia's experience connecting to broader questions of resilience across the country. From recent flooding in Texas to the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And we'll go ahead and get started with you, Gaelen. It's been almost a year, which is hard to believe. I'm curious just to sort of hear an update as to how you and your family are doing. How's the community kind of recovering at this stage?
Thanks for having me. What an honor. Well, I would say as the year anniversary approaches, that if you squint, sometimes you might not even be able to tell that the storm actually even happened. But if you know where to look and how to look, the scars and trauma is still there for sure. And I think, as anyone knows who's been through a traumatic event, the event stays in your body and in your mind equally through time. And I think while physically we're, recovering incredibly well, I think infrastructure wise and personally, since Christian and Trey were here in March, I think we've been able to turn it around and have probably our most abundant season on the farm that we've ever had, while shrinking our acreage by 2 acres. We built a new barn with trees we milled on site that were down from the storm. What did I call myself the other day? I think I called myself a post-middle-age phoenix rising from the ashes. I feel like that's a good moniker for myself. I think we're all pretty pumped up about how far we've come as a community and as a region. And I think there's a lot of love still, and a lot of pride for how much work has been done, and a lot of respect for everyone who came in and threw in with us, and got it done.
Thank you for sharing that. I think Phoenix sort of rising is a great moniker for the entire part of Western North Carolina that has experienced this storm. Christian, you brought this sort of story to us. What made you want to tell this story? How did you come across Gaelen and other communities who were featured here, and what drew you to their stories?
At the time, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, so Western North Carolina wasn't that far from me at the time that the storm was approaching the United States. And, I was in Florida at the time, covering the landfall of Hurricane Helene, when I got a phone call that I was being asked to go to Asheville, North Carolina. And I was like, Asheville? Like, why would I go to Asheville? I'm literally in the peninsula of of Florida. Why would I go there? And it turned out that, the infrastructure had completely collapsed there because of the storm, and flooding, like devastating flooding was happening there. So We drove through the night to get to Asheville and the surrounding area of Western North Carolina. And I've covered several natural disasters at this point of my career, and sort of the devastation that I found when I got there was something that I hadn't seen before. And it really stood out to me as historic. And I wanted to make sure that we covered it in such a way. And so once the breaking news of it all sort of faded away, I think a lot of us know that, the news cycles only last a couple of days or a week at the most. And when that attention faded, I was very conscious that there was still a lot going on and still a lot of work to be done to tell the story of what was happening there. And throughout that process, I had been in touch with a lot of community members and folks who follow my work, who were, asking me to check in on their loved ones on the ground there. And a mutual friend of Gaelan and mine reached out to me and said that there was, somebody that lived up in the Burnsville area who was really affected by this. And so when I brought the idea to the margin, I had, this sort of big picture of updating what it looked like 6 months later and doing a deeper dive into, taking it away from the breaking news and turning it into a more of investigative approach. And that's when I contacted Gaelan to say, hey, I think that, we should talk, and I would love to get your perspective on how this storm affected you and your family. And we were able to go back and spend some time with Gaelan and his farm and his cows uh, to tell that story. And obviously Trey came with to put words and bring it to life.
Trey, obviously you've done a lot of research and a lot of writing in the past, but to my understanding, this is one of your first times doing like reporting and more journalism related work. Can you tell us how, just sort of what that experience was stepping into this space, especially 6 months after a massive hurricane? And what was it like working with Christian on this story and bringing these, what you saw to life?
It was a blast. It's funny, I'm not a reporter who covers natural disasters or environmental events, and most of my work has been, I guess it's almost like a form of historical journalism. I was trained in history research and as a historian, and then even when I've written about contemporary events or contemporary policy issues, it's always kind of looking at the history of it. And I think that skill set applies well, just in thinking about how to look at things from the different angles, to go to the sources, to dig into the reports, to dig into the data, to try to tell people's stories. I really followed Christian's lead, and I think one of the things that happened that was just kind of a miracle and just a lot of fun to be a part of was how generous people were once we got there. We had a couple of conversations lined up for the reporting, but it really was just kind of a snowball effect. Like Gaelan was like, hey, you should talk to this person. That person was like, hey, come over right now. We'll talk to you. And then they're like, oh, you need to go talk to this person. And it just kind of like built on itself. And I think for me, I could see what Christian was capturing in the photographs. I couldn't see the actual photographs themselves on the ground, but I could see some of the images. One of the things that I was struck by was how, I don't know, everyone was really generous and loving and like positive, and that kind of like resilience. I think there's a version of this story where that doesn't come across, and it's more focused on the infrastructure or the water lines or the road recovery. And I didn't want, I guess, the people to get lost. And so when we got back from the reporting trip, I was thinking a lot about like scenes that we had been a part of, because it really did feel like each kind of person took us into a different scene in each of the different towns. And I was trying to find a way to bring in some of the like sights and sounds and capture the personalities, because everyone was just really wonderful. So that was my goal. And it's interesting, and we've talked about this a bit, right? It's like, I feel like the story almost started from the written perspective as being a bit more investigative, and then it kind of transformed through the reporting process to being more of a human interest story. And I'm really pleased it went that way. And I think that was just because of the process and the people we met. Like, we can't not talk about, we can't not try to help people like learn who Gaelan is or who Gresham is or Jennifer is. And they're just, they were a heart of it. And I think you think about the recovery and what people might be able to learn from Western North Carolina and Appalachia. I think people's resilience and like kindness and generosity. I think that that's like one of the things the places across the country can kind of grab onto, kind of emulate.
The way in which y'all were able to bring the story to life in the written word, but also in the images, it's just extraordinary. And for folks who don't know, this story is actually a finalist for the Nonprofit News Awards, and we'll find out more this week as to whether it wins or not. But just huge kudos to the two of you for bringing the story to life. And Trey, we might be having a little bit of trouble and feedback with your mic, just as an FYI. Gaelan, I'm curious. I mean, something that I often heard about sort of Appalachia and the Blue Ridge Mountains in particular is this was an area that was once considered a climate refuge. Then for it to sort of receive this amount of rain, when you first moved there, I'm curious what was on your mind when it came to climate change. Did you think that you all were susceptible to these kinds of climate impacts, and how has that changed, obviously, since Hurricane Helene has come through?
One of the interesting things about Appalachia, within the American cultural scope, is that it has such a mythos regarding it. Its culture, the music, its history. It's these tight hollers that like they're just mysterious. It's just a mysterious place, and it still is after almost 30 years of being here. I have the opportunity to discover new waterfalls like every year, which is amazing. And I think so much of this area is ruled by water. We're in a temperate rainforest. We receive upwards of 50 inches of rain a year. And so we've seen 10, 15, 18-inch rains that pump our river up to almost floods, to like flood stage-ish. But then, our soils absorb, and it's kind of like not normal, but it's also not incredibly rare to have really large scale rains. We've been here since 1998, and things, climate change as a farmer, I mean, it's kind of like a note, it affects us directly every year. Since 1998, there's numerous crops we've had to give up growing. The droughts have gotten drier, the wets have gotten wetter. As they're one of our in our community, someone has an old hemlock tree that they've posted, or maybe it's an oak, that they've posted all the high water events since the big flood in 77. And from then on, it's been just like 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet higher on the tree. And so that's a visual aid for how warming oceans are creating more precipitation, and the higher winds, weather patterns changing. So all bets are off on any given year anyway. The day of September 25th, it rained like 15 inches on that Wednesday. And I was like, whatever. I'm used to this shit. I'll be fine. And then, Thursday, it kind of chilled out. Water was still high. But then, we were like, well, if the models say if the models do what they're going to do, and we get that eye right over this valley, which did happen, we got 31 inches of rain. It rained like 3 inches an hour for like 4 hours on Friday morning. I went to bed on Thursday night, kind of just throwing out the Hail Mary. Like, I'm not necessarily a religious person, but I definitely did some praying to something. Just thinking about it, I was like, today, totally normal. Tomorrow, who knows? And yeah, we woke up to 20 feet of water in our field.
Something that emerged in the story and your telling of it in Trey's writing was just not only the devastation from the storm itself and the water that was rising, but also the fact that you weren't able to communicate with your daughters for a few days. Can you just kind of take us to that moment and what that sort of like reunification was like when you first realized that they were okay?
It's still pretty emotional. Yeah, well, that Friday morning, I was out there looking at monitoring all water levels, and our house is in an area where it gets cut off by creeks if the water gets high. So I had to go out this way where I had to drive and walk over a hill to check on the farm and how high the river was. And at a certain point, I paddle whitewater, so I have a dry suit and personal flotation device. So I put those on because rain gear just wasn't cutting it. Wind was blowing 80 miles an hour. Trees were falling. And I was like, all right, I need to get out and I need to check. My mom lives a little while away, my neighbors. So when it calmed down and stopped pouring, I got out, checked on everybody. Internet was out, cell service was gone, all electricity was gone, but I had no clue about the larger implications. I was just like, oh, maybe we got hammered. I don't know who else got hammered, blah, blah, blah. So by Friday night, all the people who had excavators, bulldozers, ATVs, dirt bikes, freaking anything were up. We had a full washout on the highway that connects us with Burnsville. So they had the night of when the flood happened, people were out there with excavators digging a road to Burnsville that ended up just being a huge mud pit. But people were going on dirt bikes and ATVs. The bear hunters around here were kind of like our special forces, tip of the spear. They were going like house to house, door to door. And so the next day on Saturday, I cut my neighbor out of his driveway and I was like, man, I don't know where my two daughters, Asha and Carmela, and my wife. I knew they were with my daughter Asha in Asheville, but I was freaked out because I had no idea how bad it was there. I knew how bad it was here by that point. And I just got in the car and slalomed over that freaking mud patch and drove to Asheville, man. It was insane. There was no one on the roads, obviously no traffic lights, ATVs and dirt bikes everywhere. And I'm sure everyone here has at some point thought, what happens when the shit hits the fan? Like, do people gun up and like get paranoid? And like, is it going to be that kind of a situation? But I had no idea what I was rolling into. But I was, it's my family. It's my loved ones. It's like the people who make me whole. And so there was no question that I was going to get to where I needed to go. And I got into Asheville and the French Broad was starting to crest. And that was freaking insane. Like, it was just insane to come from where I had come from, but then to see like, holy shit, like Asheville is getting washed down river. And then I got up into my daughter's neighborhood and there was cell service like 5 minutes away and I called her. And yeah, it was, I don't think I've ever had a feeling of wanting to touch another human like that. Yeah.
Something beautiful really came out on the other side when y'all were able to reunite and everyone sort of goes back into the house. And there's a quote that I remember where you say, "We salvage what we can." And there was, when we were debating sort of what to sort of title the story, that was something that we almost titled the story, "We salvage what we can." And there's something just really inspiring and uplifting about that. Trey, what made that sort of stand out to you? I mean, I know what stands out to me about it, but in your conversations with Gaelan, why was that so special?
I remember when we visited the farm, one of the things that stuck with me was Gaelen was walking us around and he was showing us the field and where the river had risen. And then there's just, metal scraps and tires and lumber and all these things that had, I guess, been part of the damage. And he was like, we're going to turn all of this into something new, and, whether like PVC pipes and wires. And that day I think you were working on putting up the greenhouse again that day. And so I remember we had a conversation about that, this idea that whatever, it's like, we're going to turn this wreckage into something, that works for us. And we also ended up having a conversation about how some of the relief money was coming in slowly from FEMA and USDA. And that was a story we heard from everyone. And so I think in the face of the federal government funding coming in slowly, state government funding coming in slowly. There were people who had insurance policies that were, sending in the funds they needed, or people had setups through things with FEMA or things with FEMA like reimbursement programs where you have to come up with cash up front and then try to get it back. And there were just all these ways where people weren't getting the support they needed. And so this idea that in those times, like people are going to start to rebuild with kind of the ashes that are left over or the wreckage that's left over. I just thought that image and the way Gaelen talked about it really stuck with me. And I mean, one of the things you talk about is that's just kind of your life, as a farmer and living in Appalachia, you always had to do that. And so that's kind of another thing that stood out to me is like, yeah, we all need to kind of start thinking about this. Like, if we don't get any help from the outside, what can we make of the things that are around us? How are we going to try to turn them into something that helps us, live?
Yeah, one of my favorite things that you said, I remember you turned to me and you were having like a personal, like, come to Jesus moment. You're like, I don't know if I would be able to survive this kind of a thing. And I remember like being like, Trey, you don't even know the people that lurk inside you, man. I firmly believe that you would be able to.
It's definitely in those moments, like something kicks in and you just.
Christian, y'all were in what, 6, 7 different communities or towns over the course of the reporting? How did you navigate between them? How did you land on these places and these people, and ultimately also deciding what photos you wanted to capture to sort of bring these areas to life?
We kind of went in blind in terms of which towns were going to be featured here. And something that sort of stood out to me was that, in my mind, I thought we were going in to show the world what had happened or what it still looked like in Western North Carolina. And part of that is true, and I still believe that's a result of this work. But what ended up happening is that this piece was for Western North Carolina. It was for the people in these towns who hadn't seen what it was like in these places. And so as we went along to these towns, it was either we would drive in and see who we would meet or ask around. And, people would say, like, what does it look like in Chimney Rock? What does it look like in these very, very small like Burnsville? I had never heard of Burnsville. I was calling it Brownsville on accident, and people were like, "Where's that? That's Texas." So yeah, we're just trying to like navigate and finding these really small communities that lived along the rivers, and over time, we built a collection of really powerful images that sort of told a bigger story of what it looked like in these different parts. And part of what I appreciated is in order to tell the scope and like the scale of how big this was, we were able to use this interactive data and maps and drone footage and video to really show how far apart these places were from each other. Trey and I spent a lot of time on the road getting to and from each place and being able to show like how devastating it was from be in between these different points. Um, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Jacqueline, who I think is on the call here. Jacqueline Leach reviewed my images at the end of every day, and she would pick out the best ones, and then we would have a conversation on like, okay, what's missing from this? What do we need more of? I don't think I could have done it any other way because this was so big, and I was, taking so many pictures and talking to a lot of people that it became hard to digest. And obviously, shout out to Trey, who was a really good sounding board in what this could look like ultimately in the end. I also want this piece to serve as a documentation of what happened there for the masses to see. B, a documentation for the communities that live in Appalachia and Western North Carolina. And C, I really want this to serve as a model for how to cover climate change in the future, because I know that this is going to happen again in either the same place or different parts of the country, different parts of the world. And going in and saying that, 30 inches of rain fell in one day and showing flooding and people having the worst days of their lives and then leaving and moving on to the next thing. is obviously not moving the needle in the conversation of how we can prevent this and how we can make moves to mitigate damage. And so I hope that this piece becomes that as well.
I'm biased, obviously, but I certainly think it does do a lot of those things. And we often talk internally about how extractive and exploitative a lot of coverage on climate changes, especially immediately after disaster, and how people often don't feel seen by the reporting that takes place. And I think what was really exciting for us is to see how people in the community responded to the article and to the story in such a positive way. Something that was really surprising to me just in the course of y'all's reporting was meeting Sadie, the young Amish woman who was cutting strawberries, and I think it was in Chimney Rock. I certainly imagined, to your point, Galen, like people would show up for each other and want to support one another, but you're right, you never really know whether people are going to turn inward and protect what they have, or whether neighbors are going to show up, or people from outside of your community are going to show up. How surprising was that for you, or did that sort of just solidify something that you already knew about your broader community in Western North Carolina?
I mean, I think one thing that I've always experienced here, understanding that I am a cisgendered white man living in the world, is that I've always experienced like incredible acceptance and generosity from people, regardless of like what I do, how I look, what my political beliefs are. It's almost like a joke. If you break down on the side of the road, you have to like fight off people trying to help you sometimes. So I think that was there, but these kind of things can kind of tweak people out. I think it was surprising in the way that it happened because no one was leading a charge. It was a completely decentralized, community-led effort that was each one teach one. There was no contact, no radios, no cell phones, only speaking to each other out of the windows of vehicles and or walking on the road. That's it. And still people managed to be incredibly effective about organizing medical supplies, about organizing food, checking on everybody. It was like a game of telephone that did not change the words when it got to the end. We made sure that we passed on the exact freaking messages to the people who needed to know. And it happened so quickly. I am shocked that we came together with no questions and did what needed to be done in the way that happened. There was a lot of crying, a lot of freaking just I love you said to people who you never would even probably talk to most of the time. And one of the most amazing things for me has been on reflection to see that it was the people who are marginalized who rose to the freaking top. There are a lot of times people who feel underappreciated, undervalued, who our culture just kind of like casts aside, kind of white trash, whatever you want to call it. It's like they were the people calling in helo rescues. They were the ones getting on their ATVs and driving 500 miles in a course of like 2 months to get people where they needed to go. So the fabric of the community tightened rather than loosened, and that was absolutely astounding to be a part of.
Trey, we saw that a little bit in the writing of the bluegrass kind of band that would come together every week and hearing their stories. Can you tell us just a little bit more about them and their moments, but also any other moments of just people surprising, just coming together and maybe surprising each other, or just finding ways to stick together through that challenging time?
What Gaelen, what you were saying about the messaging telephone, that was another kind of moment of community, right? So like in several of the different towns we went to, people talking about how there was a meeting spot, whether it was near a spring, near a river, and people would just come there every single morning and say, hey, have you heard from so-and-so doing, so-and-so needs this, and that kind of physical Facebook feed, I guess, so people kind of go and check in with each other. That was one of those moments as we were walking around and noticed there was a lot of art everywhere. People had put up displays of like flowers and stuffed animals and had written these posters about solidarity and strength and love. And when we were in the town of Marshall, we stopped at a coffee shop and They were another place where they had a turquoise line painted really high in the um, coffee shop that represented the high water mark. And they kind of turned it into this, it was like a scar, but it was kind of like a beautiful like testament to what had happened and the rebuilding. So the coffee shop owners told us about this bluegrass night that had happened, and we were just a few blocks down from the Marshall Depot, which was this kind of outdoor uh, open air space that they used to have bluegrass jams, different kinds of music every week, and that entire structure got lifted up from the flooding and then taken down to the town, the little town main town strip, and then it smashed into the coffee shop. And so I knew we wanted to go at least talk to people who were involved with the Marshall Depot getting destroyed in that way because we had been in the coffee shop. Yeah, we crashed their bluegrass night and asked people about their experiences. It just was amazing. And they said, just a few weeks after the hurricane happened, people were back together playing music. One person we talked to said he grabbed his dog and his guitar and he got his mom in the car and he drove. And just this idea that in these moments of crisis, like people hold on to their art, people hold on to music, people want these kind of like beautiful things to still exist. I think that's a really kind of positive reflection of who we are as humans. And those are the things that are still going to matter even in times of crisis.
Christian, I remember the image taken from outside of the jam where you have the neon sign that says live music. I think might be one of my favorite images from the story. I remember when someone inside said that it felt like a dress rehearsal, that it won't be the last time something like this happens. And it's disheartening on one hand, but just sort of hearing how everyone came together and the things that were learned hopefully can carry over. I'm curious, both from Gaelan, your experience, just sort of what you've heard from neighbors and your own personal insights, but also Trey and Christian, what you heard from over the reporting process, just how recovery efforts and help from whether it be the local, state, and federal government, how did they help? Where did they fall well short? And knowing that there have been many cuts to FEMA and to other kind of efforts since, thinking that this is potentially a dress rehearsal, how can we make ourselves more resilient in the future, knowing that we may not have help or receive help from the federal government given some of these cuts?
I'll maybe share a few numbers because I was looking at this the other day at the conversation, and the figures that estimate damages are about $60 billion in damage, and less than 10% of that has come in from the state and federal government. Governor Stein in North Carolina is still asking Congress for over $11 billion to come in as another way of recovery dollars. I think one of the things that happened very quickly was basic things like water and roads and power back up, but there's still the kind of these long-term things that need to get rebuilt, like people's homes or businesses, or just things that are going to take a long time to recreate. I think that the lesson there, given the cuts to FEMA, there have been recent changes announced that under this administration, FEMA wants to do shorter post-disaster recovery funding. This kind of idea that the federal government isn't meant to be in terms of support. They kind of come for a little bit and then get out. And I think that means there's going to be more pressure on state and local governments.
I wanted to jump in on that a little bit. I think so. I want to start by saying that I've talked to, hundreds of people that lived or live in Western North Carolina, either immediately after the storm, in like the 1 or 2 days after the storm hit, or 6 months later when I went back for this story. And not one of those people that I've spoken to have said, I'm really thankful for all the help FEMA gave us. That has never been a response, and maybe that is out there. But Galen's story and his experience is one that I've heard from everybody, where a collective community effort is what helped people pull through this crisis and this climate emergency. I mean, I'm not sure if this is the answer, but I do hope that folks learn from this in the sense that your community is your resource. And maybe there are ways to implement, strategic plans for radio communications in the event of a power outage, or if nobody can get in contact with anybody, set these rendezvous points on certain days at certain times, or people will show up if you're in trouble and you're going to go there because everyone knows to go there if something bad has happened. And so I think communities sort of bolstering their infrastructure for themselves. This is a very specific example and rare one. There was private helicopters flying into Pensacola and, these really, really remote parts hidden in the mountains, Batcave, North Carolina, where people who just knew people with helicopters were flying supplies in for days, and arguably over a week before FEMA even showed up. And so I think that if we can expect, and we're seeing reportings of cutting of funding cuts to FEMA, then I think people should adjust accordingly.
I would agree absolutely with what Trey and Christian have said. FEMA did what FEMA could. That's how I look at it. Like, they're a huge governmental organization with a ton of red tape, tons of forms to fill out. They were here in good faith trying to help people. Like, I don't fault them one bit. I just feel like American government doesn't support our citizenry in a real way, that it falls on the resilience and know-how of local communities, like you guys are saying. But I think within that is a power of community connection, and then also learning from this. Like, I know myself that I'm way more prepped for the next round than I was this time around. And I think everyone who experiences something like this, your natural inclination is not to forget. You'll just learn. We're all good students, I feel like. We want to learn. We want to build on our knowledge. And I think with funding cuts, I don't think we ever thought anyone was coming to save us. Like, I think it was great that the helos came in and dropped stuff, but we also all were like, we are going to make through this damn thing, like, regardless. Not saying we didn't need the help, just saying, like, the attitude was, we didn't care if the government was coming or not, but we're going to do this thing. And so, but over time, like, our county and our state has done a lot of amazing stuff with debris removal and road cleanup and all that kind of stuff. So the larger infrastructural projects, I would say, in my opinion, living where I live has been a net positive. But like you guys said, worst case scenario has to be in the mix always.
I was heartened to hear at the top of the call when you mentioned just how productive the farm has been this year, and even reducing the acreage by what, 2 acres, that y'all are
Yeah.
having one of your best years. I'm curious, have you yourself made some changes to how you farm in light of some of these storms, and obviously the risks that the rivers present when it comes to any sort of massive amounts of rains that might come in?
As my friend Tall likes to say, if you look at river valleys where we live, these floods are what created the areas in which we farm, because it's flatlands right next to a river. And I have about 6 to 8 feet of sandy loam before the flood, but I've made some pseudoscience assumptions because I found a ton of indigenous artifacts that within that strata that we haven't seen a flood of this magnitude for thousands of years, just because all that stuff is quite near the plow pan. And so I had a friend of mine date it, and some of it goes back 8,000 years. And so my basic assumptions are that it's, a couple to a few thousand years since we've seen an event like this. And so I have no control over that, because the river breaks its banks above where our farm is and just washes through. But what I have noticed is what happened during the flood. If you zoom out to kind of a non-human perspective, macro geological view, is that the riverbanks are steeper, timber got piled along the edge. And so in a way, it's made it a more effective bulwark against the next flood event where I live. I can't say that for everyone, but that's how I'm choosing to look at it. I'm leaving my debris piles on my main field, letting them break down into humus. Hopefully, I'm going to plant new hardwoods along the riparian zone to hold the stream banks together. We're planting elderberry, river cane, all that stuff. So there's been a real renewed effort to be intentional with how we think about the new day and what we do. My farming practices, I feel like, have always been pretty climate sound. Like, we try and retain moisture, we try and plant intensively, use as few fossil fuels as we can, and just try and mimic nature as best we can as farmers. So
if y'all can just sort of reflect on what sort of recovery and resilience sort of means in light of this story, but also the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and of course the floods that happened in Texas and are happening around the world. I know Brazil just had some massive flooding recently as well, and these events are sadly becoming more prevalent and are showing up in places that we least expected. However, time and time again, I think people are showing up for one another in ways that are remind us what community truly looks like. But when we think about recovery and resilience, what sort of other things or reflections come to mind?
As these events happen more frequently, it's just going to be harder for us to pay attention, for us to support people in these communities. And one of the lessons I think from the pandemic was that people can get accustomed to great suffering very quickly and be okay with mass amounts of suffering. You kind of have to keep going the next day. And so one of my goals coming out of this is just to remember, like, check back in months later, check back in years later, because there are places where people still need your help. And even spending time in, in Portland now, there's still scars from Katrina.
I love what you said just in terms of returning to a place after the storm.
It's an interesting question. I think personally, I want to not be the crab in the boiling water where suddenly I'm cooked, right? I want to stay alert, and I want to know that as a documentarian, as a photojournalist, as a truth seeker and teller, that I'm constantly looking for the thing that is undeniable and making sure that is never lost on me. I think I'm bringing that up because I'm thinking back to the sort of the main image on this story, where we see like a rusted car underwater. And I actually hadn't seen that. Like I had seen it. I noticed it, and I didn't think to take a picture until Trey said like, "Whoa, that's crazy. Like, did you see this car underwater?" And I had this moment of like, "Oh yeah, I guess I've seen it so many times that I can walk past it and look for or think that I'm looking for something else that's more sort of impactful." And then, after Trey sort of said that, I realized like, oh yeah, that's still the thing. That's something that's important to show here. And I'm glad that that picture made it as sort of like the headline for this piece, because I think that, this will continue to happen, as you said, and a 20-year anniversary of Katrina is something that a conversation we're going to be having in 20 years of the anniversary of Hurricane Helene. And I hope that in 20 years, people are still able to see the importance and find the important moments of how this is going to continue to impact communities in our country.
Gaelan, as we close, is there anything that you'd want to leave folks with? Ways in which people can support you, support the community, things that they can keep in mind, especially in light of this conversation and in the article itself?
I'm always left with the fact that all of us are so much more resilient and optimistic than we ever give ourselves credit for. I think recognizing the dangers of climate and change and their effects does not cancel out our humanity. And I think connecting with my humanity through this event has been probably the most powerful experience of my life. And connecting with people like Trey and Christian and you and just everyone. There's the natural world and then there's the human world. And for me, I'm a human living in the human world, and I'm proud to be human. I'm proud to express my humanity, and I hope we all can weather all these things by connecting deeper with who we are as humans.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's certainly our hope. I just want to thank the three of you for making time to be here, and for sharing your stories and insight. It's personally been a privilege for me to edit this story and to work with all of y'all. And I'm glad we got to bring it to the world. And so for everyone who tuned in, please sign up for our newsletter to stay tuned for future events like these. And we have our fall issue that will be coming out in October and November, so stay tuned for that. And if you're feeling so kind, please make a donation to The Margin. We're a nonprofit independent outlet that does investigative, data-driven journalism that really centers humanity at its core. And so if you care about this kind of reporting and want to see more of it, we greatly appreciate it.